Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're uncovering something super fascinating, the often misunderstood dynamics between deaf restaurant workers and their hearing managers. We usually think of restaurants as this intensely loud, purely auditory environment, right? But when we look closely at the research, a totally different, much more complex picture emerges.
So, let's dive right in and really challenge our preconceptions. In a kitchen where chefs are constantly shouting orders, what actually happens when your absolute best worker can't hear them? It's a space practically built on verbal callbacks and shouted warnings. Asking what happens when someone can't hear those cues? Well, that opens up a brilliant window into workplace accommodation, culture, and just incredible human adaptability.
Welcome to the kitchen.
To really understand these dynamics, we first have to recognize that the culinary industry naturally tests the limits of any worker. But recent studies, like one from the International Journal for Studies on Children, Women, Elderly, and Disabled, reveal that hospitality graduates with hearing disabilities face some really unique hurdles. Even with all the recent progress in workplace diversity, they're still encountering heavy workloads, peer discrimination, and massive communication barriers when trying to get their careers off the ground. And honestly, this data sets the stage for a much deeper systemic issue.
Moving on to Section 2, Defining Autism.
Before we get into the day-to-day grind of kitchen staff, we really need to define the invisible root of these challenges. It's kind of impossible to fully grasp the friction in these kitchens without understanding the underlying bias fueling it. And that brings us to a concept called autism. Coined by scholar Tom Humphreys back in 1975, it essentially describes an unconscious stigma based on hearing ability. Basically, it's the assumption that doing things the hearing way is just inherently better or more competent than doing them the deaf way.
Here's the crucial point, though. Autism isn't always intentional malice. Actually, scratch that. It rarely is. It mostly shows up as low expectations. It happens when employers totally underestimate a deaf worker's true capabilities just because they communicate differently. Or, when they hesitate to make super simple accommodations because they wrongly assume the barrier is just too big to overcome. It's a real wake-up call for all of us to examine how we unconsciously measure competence in our own workplaces.
Section 3. The Manager's View.
For a lot of hearing managers, this might be their very first time supervising a deaf employee. But, interestingly enough, their initial impressions are almost always incredibly positive. Take this quote from the research, for example. Managers frequently praise their employees for basically being immune to distracting kitchen gossip and for having this intense level of focus. Without the distraction of that constant verbal chatter that derails a lot of hearing workers, deaf employees are often recognized as literally some of the most reliable and efficient people on the line.
However, despite all that goodwill, a kind of complex dynamic emerges. Managers often end up displaying this paternalistic protectiveness. And sure, it's probably well-intentioned, but it unintentionally stunts their employees' career growth. They start viewing the deaf worker as someone who needs to be shielded from the chaos rather than, empowered to navigate it.
For instance, just look at this quote from a restaurant manager. They restricted a deaf worker to doing maintenance in the dish room out of this completely misguided fear that the worker couldn't be safe around hot food or sharp knives without hearing spoken warnings. They basically assumed that a lack of hearing automatically equaled a lack of spatial awareness. Crazy, right?
But here is the ultimate reality check. Research reveals that deaf individuals actually have significant increases in visual and tactile senses. We're talking sometimes 10-fold increases. They're highly attuned to vibrations, quick movements, and visual cues. So, in practical terms, a visual signal or a quick tap on the shoulder is just as effective, if not way more effective, than someone shouting behind you in an incredibly loud kitchen. They are for sure exceptionally safe workers.
Which brings us to Section 4, the worker's experience.
Let's move over to the other side of the pass. What does it actually feel like to be highly capable yet constantly underestimated? Well, deaf workers are super motivated and totally confident in their culinary skills. They know they have the talent. Yet the research notes they frequently feel intensely frustrated by the lack of upward mobility. They absolutely know they can do the job, but they're constantly hitting this invisible ceiling built entirely by their manager's misconceptions.
A major point of friction here all comes down to accommodation. Hearing managers tend to rely heavily on lip reading and quick gestures. Why? Because it's convenient for them. It doesn't require the manager to really change their behavior at all. But for deaf workers, speech reading is overwhelmingly the least effective, most error-prone, and literally the most exhausting method of communication, especially during a crazy dinner rush. This quote perfectly captures that daily exhaustion we're talking about. I mean, just imagine trying to read lips in a fast-paced environment while your colleagues are constantly looking down to chop vegetables, turning away to plate food, or just walking past you. The entire burden of translation gets placed squarely on the deaf worker, leading to intense fatigue and a lot of silent frustration.
Ultimately, this huge communication barrier leads to extreme underestimation. Deaf workers report feeling forced to constantly prove their basic competency to managers. And sadly, because these managers usually lack any formal ADA training or real knowledge of proper accommodations, deaf employees are rarely considered for promotions. They get trapped in entry-level back-of-house roles regardless of their actual skill level. It just goes to show exactly why formal ADA training isn't just some legal checkbox, but an absolutely vital tool for talent management.
Sometimes, though, these assumptions reach almost comical levels of ignorance, as perfectly highlighted by this incredible anecdote from the research. Get this. A general manager was genuinely shocked to learn a deaf employee could drive a car. No way, right? But when the baseline of understanding is that low, it's really easy to see why promoting that exact same worker to a shift lead feels completely unfathomable to the manager.
Let's look at solutions in Section 5, Bridging the Gap.
So how on earth do we bridge this massive gap between well-meaning but uninformed managers and highly capable but frustrated deaf workers? Well, the first step is closing the accommodation gap. We absolutely have to move away from what managers think works, like lip reading, and start implementing what deaf workers actually need to do their jobs safely and efficiently.
The solutions are actually surprisingly simple, and honestly, they usually cost absolutely nothing. Instead of shouting half-pan across a chaotic room, just write the menu item on a whiteboard where the deaf cook can easily read it. Implement a system of gentle shoulder taps for spatial awareness. And for those really important, nuanced conversations, like job interviews or formal performance reviews, bring in a professional ASL interpreter. It makes a world of difference.
And perhaps the absolute most inspiring takeaway from all this research is the phenomenon of organic inclusion. The data highlights this amazing thing called Kitchen ASL, where deaf workers actively, voluntarily teach their hearing colleagues basic signs. So hearing cooks are out there learning signs from meats, cook, or what's up. And you know what? This doesn't just solve communication issues. It creates genuine, nonverbal social cohesion and a deeply connected, badass team environment. When we finally strip away the stigma of autism and stop making these wild assumptions about what people can and cannot do, we reveal an incredible asset. We find a fiercely loyal, highly focused talent pool that can elevate literally any hospitality business. All it really takes is a willingness for management to make just a few minor, thoughtful adjustments to their workflow.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Isn't it time we stopped expecting people to endlessly adapt to broken, inaccessible systems and started designing our workspaces and truly our whole world to fit all human experiences? Thanks so much for exploring this explainer with me.